A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park.
Chapter 4 Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya's mother took the plastic container from her and emptied the water into 3 large jars. She handed Naya a bowl of boiled sorghum meal and poured a little milk over it. Naya sat outside in the shade of the house and ate. When she was done, she took the bowl back inside. Her mother was nursing the baby, Naya's little brother. "Take Akir with you," her mother said, nodding towards Naya's sister. Glancing at her younger sister, Naya did not say what she was thinking, that Akir, who was only 5 years old, was too small and walked too slowly. "She needs to learn," her mother said. Naya nodded. She picked up the plastic container and took Akir by the hand. Home for just long enough to eat, Naya would now make her second trip to the pond and back, to the pond and back, nearly a full day of walking altogether. This was Naya's daily routine 7 months of the year. Daily. Every single day. Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva held his breath as he scanned the faces, one by one. Then the air left his lungs and seemed to take all hope with it. Strangers, no one from his family. The old woman came up behind him and greeted the group. "Where are you going?" she asked. A few of the people exchanged uneasy glances. There was no reply. The woman put her hand on Salva's shoulder. "This one is alone. Will you take him with you?" Salva saw the doubt on the people's faces. Several men at the front of the group began speaking to each other. "He is a child. He'll slow us down." "Another mouth to feed? It is already hard enough to find food. He is too young to do any real work. He'll be of no help to us." Salva hung his head. They would leave him behind again, just as the others had. Then a woman in the group reached out and touched the arm of one of the men. She said nothing, but looked first at the man and then at Salva. The man nodded and turned to the group. "We will take him with us," he said. Salva looked up quickly. A few in the group were shaking their heads and grumbling. The man shrugged. "He is Dinka," he said, and began walking again. The old woman gave Salva a bag of peanuts and a gourd for drinking water. He thanked her and he said goodbye. Then he caught up with the group, determined not to lag behind, not to complain, not to be any trouble to anyone. He did not even ask where they were going, for fear that his questions would be unwelcome. He knew only that they were Dinka and that they were trying to stay away from the war. He had to be content with that. The days became a never-ending walk. Salva's feet kept time with the thoughts in his head, the same words over and over. "Where is my family? Where is my family?" Every day he woke and walked with the group, rested at midday, and walked again until dark. They slept on the ground. The terrain changed from scrub to woodland. They walked among stands of stunted trees. There was little to eat, a few fruits here and there, always either unripe or worm-rotten. Salva's peanuts were gone by the end of the 3rd day. After about a week, they were joined by more people, another group of Dinka and several members of the tribe called the Jerkol. Men and women, boys and girls, old and young, walking, walking to nowhere. Salva had never been so hungry. He stumbled along, somehow moving one foot ahead of the other, not noticing the ground he walked on or the forest around him or the light in the sky. Nothing was real except his hunger, once a hollow in his stomach but now a deep buzzing pain in every part of him. Usually he walked among the Dinka, but today, shuffling along in a daze, he found he had fallen a little behind. Walking next to him was a young man from the Jerkol. Salva didn't know much about him, except that his name was Buksa. As they walked along, Buksa slowed down. Salva wondered sluggishly if they shouldn't try to keep up a bit better. Just then Buksa stopped walking. Salva stopped too, but he was too weak and hungry to ask why they were standing still. Buksa cocked his head and furrowed his brows, listening. They stood motionless for several moments. Salva could hear the noise of the rest of the group ahead of them, a few faint voices, birds calling somewhere in the trees. He strained his ears. What was it? Jet planes? Bombs? Was the gunfire getting closer instead of further away? Salva's fear began to grow until it was even stronger than his hunger. Then, a slow smile spread over Buksa's face. "There, you hear?" Salva frowned and shook his head. Yes, there it is again. Come. Buxa began walking very quickly. Salva struggled to keep up. Twice Buxa paused to listen, then kept going even faster. What? Salva started to ask. Buxa stopped abruptly in front of a very large tree. Yes, he said, now go call the others. By now, Salva had caught the feeling of excitement. But what should I tell them? The bird, the one I was listening to. He led me right here. Buxa's smile was even bigger now. You see that? He pointed up at the branches of the tree. A beehive, a fine, large one. Salva hurried up to call the rest of the group. He had heard of this, that the jerkole could follow the call of the bird called the honey guide, but he had never seen it done before. Honey. This night they would feast.
Chapter 5 Southern Sudan, 2008. There was a big lake 3 days' walk from Naya's village. Every year, when the rain stopped and the pond near the village dried up, Naya's family moved from their home to a camp near the big lake. Naya's family did not live by the lake all year round because of the fighting. Her tribe, the Nuer, often fought with a rival Dinka tribe over the land surrounding the lake. Men and boys were hurt and even killed when the two groups clashed. So Naya and the rest of her village lived at the lake only during the few months of the dry season, when both tribes were so busy struggling for survival that the fighting occurred far less often. Like the pond back home, the lake was dried up, but because it was much bigger than the pond, the clay of the lake bed still held water. Naya's job at the lake camp was the same as at home, to fetch water. With her hands, she would dig a hole in the damp clay of the lake bed. She kept digging, scooping out handfuls of clay until the hole was as deep as her arm was long. The clay got wetter as she dug, until, at last, water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. The that filled the hole was filthy, more mud than liquid. It seeped in so slowly that it took a long time to collect, even a few gourds full. Naya would crouch by the hole, waiting for water. Here, for hours at a time, and every day for 5 months, until the rains came and she and her family could return home. Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva's eye was swollen shut. Buxa's forearms were lumpy and raw. A friend of Buxa's had a fat lip. They all looked as though they had been in a terrible fist fight, but their injuries weren't bruises. They were bee stings. A fire had been started under the tree to smoke the bees out of the hive and make them sleepy. But as Buxa and the other Jur men were removing the hive from the trees, the bees woke up and were not at all happy to discover that their home was being taken away. They expressed their unhappiness very clearly by buzzing, swarming, and stinging a lot. It was worth it, Salva thought as he touched his eye gingerly. His belly was a rounded lump stuffed full of honey and beeswax. Nothing had ever tasted so good as those pieces of honeycomb dripping with rich, luscious gold sweetness. Along with everyone else in the group, he had eaten as much as he could hold, and then a little more. All around him, people were licking their fingers in great satisfaction, except for one, Dinka man, who had already been stung on his tongue. It was swollen so badly that he could not close his mouth. He could hardly swallow. Salva felt very sorry for him. The poor man couldn't even enjoy the honey. The walking seemed easier now that Salva had something in his belly. He had managed to save one last piece of honeycomb and had wrapped it carefully in a leaf. By the end of the next day, all the honey was gone, but Salva kept the beeswax in his mouth and chewed it for the memory of sweetness. The group got a little bigger with each passing day. More people joined them, people who had been walking alone or in little clusters or of two or three. Salvo made it a habit to survey the whole group every morning and evening, searching for his family, but they were never among the newcomers. One evening, a few weeks after Salva had joined the group, he made his usual walk around the fireside, scanning every face in the hope of seeing a familiar one. Then, ouch! Salva almost lost his footing as the ground underneath him seemed to move. A boy jumped to his feet and stood in front of him. Hey, that was my hand you stepped on. The boy spoke Dinka, but with a different accent, which meant that he was not from the area around Salva's village. Salva took a step back. Sorry, are you hurt? The boy opened and closed his hand a few times, then shrugged. It's all right, but you really should watch where you're going. Sorry, Salva repeated. After a moment's silence, he turned away and began searching the crowd again. The boy is still looking at him. Your family? He asked. Salva shook his head. Me too, the boy said. He sighed, and Salva heard that sigh all the way to his heart. Their eyes met. I'm Salva. I'm Mariel. It was a good to make a friend. Mariel was the same age as Salva. They were almost the same height. When they walked side by side, their strides were exactly the same length, and the next morning they began walking together. Do you know where you're going? Salva asked. Mariel tilted his head up and put his hand on his brow to shade his eye from the rising sun. East, he said wisely. We are walking in the morning sun. Salva rolled his eyes. I know we're going east, he said. Anyone could tell that, but where in the east? Mario thought for a moment. Ethiopia, he said. East of Sudan is Ethiopia. Salva stopped walking. Ethiopia? That is another country. We can't walk all the way there. We are walking east, Mariel said firmly. Ethiopia is east. I can't go to another country, Salva thought. If I do, my family will never find me. Mariel put his arm around Salva's shoulder. He seemed to know what Salva was thinking, for he said, It doesn't matter. Don't you know that if we keep walking east, we'll go all the way around the world and come back here to Sudan? That's when we'll find our families. Salva had to laugh. They were both laughing as they started walking again, arm in arm, their strides matching perfectly. More than a month had passed since Salva had run from his school into the bush. Their group was now walking in the land of the Atuat people. In the Dinka language, the Atuat were called the people of the lion. Their region was inhabited by large herds of antelope, wild beasts, gnus, and the lions that preyed upon them. The Dinka told stories about the Atuat. When an Atuat person died, he came back to earth as a lion with a great hunger for the human flesh he once had. The lions in the Atuat region were said to be the fiercest in the whole world. Nights became uneasy. Salva woke often to the sound of roars in the distance, and sometimes to the death squeal of an animal under a lion's claws. One morning he woke bleary eyed after a poor sleep. He rubbed his eyes, rose, and stumbled after Mariel as they began walking yet again. Salva! It was not Mariel who had spoken. The voice had come from behind them. Salva turned. His mouth fell open in amazement, but he could not speak. Salva!
Chapter 6, Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya's family had been coming to the lake camp for generations. Naya herself had been there every year since she was born. One thing she liked about the camp was that, even though she had to dig in the clay and wait for water, she did not have to make the 2 long trips to the pond every day. But this year she realized for the first time that her mother hated the camp. They had no house and had to sleep in makeshift shelters. They could not bring most of their things, so they had to make do with whatever was at hand, and for much of each day they had to dig for water. But the worst was the look on her mother's face when Naya's father and older brother, Dep, went off to hunt. Fear. Her mother was afraid that the men in the family would run into Dinka tribesmen somewhere, that they would fight and get injured, or worse. They had been lucky all these years. No one from Naya's family had been hurt or killed by Dinka, but she knew other families in the village who had lost loved ones this way. Naya could see the questions in her mother's face every morning. Would they be lucky again, or was it now their turn to lose someone? Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva's mouth closed and opened again as if he were a fish. He tried to speak, but no sound came out of his throat. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. Salva, the man said again and hurried towards him. When the man was only a few steps away, Salva suddenly found his voice. Uncle, he cried out and ran into the man's arms. Uncle Jawir was the younger brother of Salva's father. Salva hadn't seen him in at least 2 years because Uncle had been in the army. Uncle must know about the war and the fighting. Maybe he will know where my family is. But these hopes were dashed as soon as Uncle spoke. Are you alone? Where is your family? He asked. Salva hardly knew where to begin his answer. It seemed like years since he had run away from his school and into the bush, but he told his uncle everything as best as he could. As Salva spoke, Uncle nodded or shook his head. His face became very solemn when Salva told him that he had not seen nor heard a single word of his family in all that time. Salva's voice trailed off, and he lowered his head. He was glad to see Uncle again, but it looked as if he might not be much help either. Uncle was quiet for a moment, then he patted Salva's shoulder. "Eh, nephew?" he said in a cheerful voice. "We are together now, so I will look after you." It turned out that Uncle had joined the group 3 days earlier, but since there were more than 30 people traveling together, they had not found each other until now. As they began walking, Salva saw that Uncle had a gun, a rifle that he carried on a strap over one shoulder. Already Salva could tell that because of his army experience and because he had a gun, Uncle was seen by the group as a kind of leader. "Yes, when I left the army they let me keep my rifle," Uncle said, "so I'm going to shoot us a fine meal as soon as we come across anything worth eating." Uncle was true to his word. That very day he shot a young antelope, the kind called a topi. Salva could hardly wait for it to be skinned and butchered and roasted. As the smoky, meaty aroma filled the air, he had to keep swallowing the saliva that flooded his mouth. Uncle laughed as he watched Salva gobble down his first piece of the meat. "Salva, you have teeth. You're supposed to use them when you eat." Salva could not reply. He was too busy stuffing another chunk of the delicious charred meat into his mouth. Even though the topi was a small one, there was more than enough meat for everyone in the group. But it did not take long for Salva to regret his haste in eating. After so many weeks of near starvation, his stomach rebelled mightily. He spent most of the night vomiting. Salva was not alone. Whenever his heaving stomach woke him, he would hurry to the edge of the camp to vomit and find others there doing the same. At one point, Salva found himself in a line of half a dozen people, all in an identical pose, bent over, holding their stomachs and waiting for the next wave of nausea. It might have been funny if he hadn't felt so miserable. The group continued to walk through the land of the Atuot. Every day they saw lions, usually resting in the shade of the small trees. Once, in the distance, they saw a lion chasing a topi. The topi escaped, but along the path Salva saw the bones of prey that had not been so fortunate. Salva and Mariel still walked together, staying close to Uncle. Sometimes Uncle would walk with the other men and talk seriously about the journey. At those times, Salva and Mariel would drop back respectfully, but Salva always tried to keep Uncle in sight, and he slept near Uncle at night. One day the group began walking in the late afternoon with hopes of reaching a waterhole before settling down for the night. But there was no water anywhere, though they searched for miles. They kept walking into the night and through the night. For 10 hours they walked, and by dawn everyone was exhausted. Uncle and the other leaders finally decided that the group had to rest. Salva took 2 steps off the path and fell asleep almost before he lay down. He did not wake until he felt Uncle's hand shaking his shoulder. As he opened his eyes, he heard wailing. Someone was crying. Salva blinked away the sleepiness and looked at Uncle, whose face was very solemn. "I'm sorry, Salva," Uncle said quietly. "Your friend, Mariel?" Salva looked around. He should be somewhere nearby. I don't remember if he slept near me. I was so tired. Perhaps he had gone to find something to eat. Uncle stroked Salva's head as if he were a baby. "I am sorry," he said again. A cold fist seemed to grip Salva's heart.